Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be invited. I am Stephen Jansto and appreciate the opportunity to present on carbon capture, transport, and sequestration. I've worked many years as a material scientist, primarily in the steel industry. So I've become very concerned about the proposals to use low-cost steel for carbon sequestration, even repurpose steel pipelines for long-distance transport. Years ago, I brought up the corrosion risk to a steel industry consortium in the United States. But with the government incentives, I am afraid serious risk, especially to our environment, public health, and water, are being downplayed or even dismissed. From my experience, it's obvious the technological, economic, and safety risk have so far been inadequately considered before going forward with what is being planned. I will also discuss this afternoon some of the environmental and financial consideration, such as the impacts to water and the energy cost overall. At least CO2 waste is classified as a hazardous liquid, unlike fracking waste, which is falsely classified as non-hazardous. Yet, as we know, that still does not mean that the CO2 waste will be handled with necessary regulations. So far, most of the carbon dioxide waste stream that is being considered here is different from the relatively pure CO2 that has been used in the past for recovery, acronym EOR. These are two very different applications for transport and injection, and that must be duly noted, especially if anyone is thinking about repurposing an existing low carbon pipeline to carry CO2 waste. We need very different regulations compared to EOR because of the corrosive properties of waste CO2 and the proposed long distance transport. MSA did promulgate rules, and it was a good first step. But with the new administration, I have no idea of the status of those rules, which need much stricter regulations than what they had proposed so far for waste CO2. So far, I am not aware of any economically and technically successful CCS projects connected to waste gas CO2, its transport and sequestration over time and long distance. Corrosion is already a known problem, and much more study, including worst case scenario corrosion studies, is needed to define the materials and processes to safely sequester waste CO2 over time. There are both internal and external risks from outside a pipeline and from within. The geology of the pipeline route and sequestration boundaries must be fully studied, as well as what steel properties are needed to withstand CO2 waste corrosion from carbonic acid, nitric acid, sulfuric acid, hydrogen sulfide, and perhaps other impurities. Already, corrosion in existing pipelines is a huge cost. So the work it would take to determine the best materials and processes before moving forward with CO2 sequestration could pay for itself in the long run in avoiding future costs and damages. CCS is a complicated and expensive process. The variability of the CO2 waste gas composition and the moisture content variations of exported CO2 have yet to be defined for a robust corrosion study. To sequester CO2, steps must be taken all along the process to ensure it is done properly. For instance, it's imperative to capture as much CO2 at the source as possible and remove the waste gas impurities before the carbon capture and sequestration process is done, with many more considerations along the way. As Cynthia mentioned this morning, there's a huge water quantity and quality impact that is not even being studied all along the process. Besides how much energy we consume to sequester carbon is how much water is consumed. There are studies that have been done that show the overall total water consumption and energy footprint could offset what is captured and stored. We need to understand the water consumption and possible water contamination in the CCS cradle to grave analysis, along with energy costs to construct and operate. I will quickly present a few case studies that illustrate these important concerns. Petronova was one of the first large-scale carbon sequestration projects in the US, largely subsidized by the DOE, who did study the operation that gives us some good information about how it worked. In this case study, it became obvious that operational inefficiencies were a key reason why the project closed after only 3 years of operation. Whereas the story goes that the project failed the conditions when the DOE study is reviewed, it becomes quite obvious that there was excessive equipment downtime, corrosion problems with heat exchangers, compressors, seals. Petronova is a good example of the various hurdles of CO2 separation, purification, processing, and sequestering. The second case study is Sequestration. Most people know about the disastrous pipe explosion in Mississippi that sent many people to the hospital, and it was a miracle no one was killed. I would still like to see any corrosion study of the pipeline that failed there. This explosion, interestingly, was blamed on soil movement, but there is more to that because pipeline steels are designed to be able to move with soil that is saturated. Also, many people do not realize released because Denbury could not close an emergency valve because of the frozen carbon dioxide. It is very important that we learn from this disaster, especially to ensure that no company is allowed to interfere with a proper investigation. A $2 million penalty is an insignificant amount to pay for obstructing such an important PHMSA investigation, in my opinion. We downplay corrosion risk and pay the consequences later. Archer Daniels in Decatur, Illinois, has had recent failures at the monitoring wells, and the investigation is ongoing. The US EPA regulations require that the CO2 waste stream contents be analyzed and reported. So we sent to FOIA a request for the actual composition of waste gas, but the US EPA redacted much of the information to understand the CO2 waste stream from ethanol production. Until the results of a thorough investigation are known, we will not know the cause and full extent of the failures, but we know enough to be concerned about risks to groundwater over time at Archer Daniels in Decatur, Illinois. Even the EPA admitted there are design flaws that need to be addressed before carbon sequestration can be done on a larger scale. At least CCS is getting some cautionary press. EPA has concluded that dozens of planned projects contain dangerous flaws, design flaws, even when more expensive steel grades like chromium-13, which was used at Archer Daniels. Even when using upgraded material, the EPA has concluded that carbon injection well permits that specify 13 and a special cement used by the industry to secure those pipes, in quotes from the EPA, are not suitable for construction of these wells in most instances, particularly under potentially corrosive conditions when both water and carbon dioxide are present. Plus, where will we be able to purchase the steel? There's really only one mill in the States that can make a 25 chrome, so the vast majority of the material would probably be imported from Asia. Case study 4 in Sulphur, Louisiana illustrates that it is not all just the steel compressor, the pipe, but seals can cause failures, even when CO2 is used for EOR, which is normally, again, a much more pure CO2 composition than the proposed waste gas CO2 for EOR. We learned additional research is needed. Much work, much more needs to be done, even with an estimated $479 billion of government spending and funding. Will safe carbon capture, transport, and sequestration be possible? Also, even with the expensive 45Q credits, have the total costs of water and the energy footprint been considered overall? I have not seen the calculations for the total scope 1, 2, and 3 costs of the overall sequestration operation. As a researcher, it was good to see one of the few actual reports of total water usage provided by the DOE, and the amount of water needed was huge, almost 500 million gallons on average per year at Petronova. This is what, along with the cost to do sequestration. We have not properly evaluated the risk and proper solutions based on the lessons learned to date. It is obvious we need to look at the entire pipeline system and the equipment, materials engineering, mechanical and chemical engineering design. There are ways to be more protective against corrosion, such as clad pipe, gas cleaning systems, air liquide proposals to remove contaminants at the source of emissions, but this all adds to the expense of the facilities. This material cost comparison, putting on my MBA hat, I look at materials and project cost benefit analysis over time, and it just doesn't make sense. I would not invest in CCS as a company because it is the fiduciary responsibility of the corporate executives and their direct reports for the ultimate safety of the CCS systems for the long term. I would not even want to be the professional engineer signing off on carbon sequestration to be done as proposed, especially if an existing 40-year-old steel pipeline is being repurposed to do so. For example, to do it right if it can be done. There's additional costs beyond materials engineering and equipment, monitoring for leaks, purification of the waste gas. There are more case studies, and the link with Kemper is an example. There's a smaller scale carbon sequestration project that was initiated in Saskatchewan, Canada, and then Kemper built their plant. So we'll follow that to define best practices and see how successful Saskatchewan might be over time. Even so, it is highly unlikely to be cost effective when compared to other solutions, such as reducing the amount of CO2 emissions to begin with, rather than drill baby drill, burn baby burn, bury baby bury. Where is the PHMSA report considerations and proposed regulations and due diligence? Once again, as a CEO looking at the cost effectiveness and the huge dependency on fickle government policies, would I invest in CCS? No way, especially considering the long-term liability. Waste CO2 has no worth and must be safely disposed of forever. No one wants to own it. No one will want the liability to keep it sequestered over time. If sequestering is the only answer to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, the government, aka our tax dollars, will have to pay for it with monitoring and any necessary remediation for leaks and releases forever. So I've been looking at waste CO2 gas transportation and sequestration for years and have yet to see research that can justify the safe and economic reduction of CO2 in the atmosphere to the scale that is needed using carbon sequestration. To offset the costs with EOR means even more carbon in the atmosphere when the oil is burned. So that is not a true cost offset in my book. Wearing my MBA hat, I have not seen projections for the total cost to be able to sequester enough carbon to mitigate carbon climate change. To go this route, it is obvious that large government subsidies like 45Q will be required over a long period of time to support CO2 waste gas transport and sequestration. Is this the way we want our public funds to be spent? An even bigger question is how could these funds be better spent to not produce the CO2 in the first place? There's much more to learn, starting with a thorough corrosion study and overall cost calculation when compared to alternatives to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. The constant effort to present the facts, lessons learned, and to derive better solutions and alternatives need to be given priority. This is my executive summary from a great deal of research looking at the entire process and cost of CCS, CCUS. We don't have a whole lot of time to steer the ship in the right direction. I welcome any questions or comments, so please get in touch with me. Thank you very much.
And as John and Dr. Baca come on up, I'm supposed to check and see if there are any online questions to start. Sure. So the first question is for Dr. Jansto. It says, have you presented your findings to the Department of Energy?
I have sent FERC comments a couple years ago, which encompasses some of these issues that I brought up. Yes.
But no response.
So just to follow up, was there any response?
No.
Okay. All right. The next question is for Dr. Baca. It says, have you considered doing a similar study in northeastern Pennsylvania, considering the data presented by Justin Mackey, i.e. the highest levels of radiation are from those northeast wells?
Yep. Is this working? Yeah, so Nat Warner, who is one of the authors on this study, he was part of that seminal Duke study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, and they were studying the Northeast. I don't think he did radiation testing, but.
Right.
Yeah, but then like what you often do is like ratio analysis to understand what the radiation content might be. But I think if we had the funding, we would certainly be interested in going up there.
Here's another question. I think
I don't know.
this is a question for all speakers. It says, are you sharing slides? In particular, can you restore the links Dr. Jansto shared at the end? I think that's for the team in the back.
Yeah, that's no problem. I'd be happy to.
It's been confirmed it's going to be shared, so thank you for that question. All right. I guess it's my turn to ask questions.
Well, we've beaten them out of it, you know. Everybody seems to be sated. It's the post-lunch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess the thing that's fascinating to me is that high radon levels in the water.
Yeah.
And so just out of curiosity, when you sort of inform the well owner, what kind of advice are you giving them?
Talking to them about on mitigation systems, and also to do, first of all, do a follow-up test, seal up your basement, do the overnight 12-hour test. And then something that we noticed in a lot of the homes, they would call it a passive radon mitigation system. This was like a PVC pipe just on the side of the house, no fan. And shockingly, sometimes the PVC just went up to the window of a bedroom. Please don't do that. You need that pipe to get up above the roof line, and spend the $100 to put the fan in to get the drop.
But you didn't do any in-home testing to sort of check the ramifications in those basements of the high?
No, we just gave them guidance.
Okay. And then in terms of the radium, it's hard to keep that soluble. So I'm just wondering why, were there any sediments or things that you pulled out of the well you tested to try to see if those had moved on to the sediments themselves?
That's a good question for Nat. I can take back and follow up with you.
Oh, here comes another question.
No, but like we were filtering the samples too, so I don't think we had sediments.
You could count the filters. Here's another question. Does it make sense to convert unconventional fracking wells to geothermal energy systems?
That's the second time that's been asked. That's the second time it's been asked, and we didn't get an answer the last time. I think that this whole idea of repurposing, there are things, even when we talk about repurposing a conventional well as an injection well, we don't know where these things are going. And that's the problem. And sometimes when you push stuff down the hole, stuff comes up the hole that you weren't expecting. So I think to say that we could, conceivably do this, unfortunately, it requires, I'm assuming that it would be an open system as opposed to a closed system. And once again, in that sort of situation, and folks who know about hydrology and solubilization fronts and things like that realize that, you could pump down. I'll give an example. Many years ago, I was briefly involved in a project down in Florida, and they were taking ozonated water that had been collected during the rainy season in South Florida, and they were injecting it into depleted aquifers. The problem was the ozonated water was solubilizing all the arsenic that was in the underlying rock, and so they would put down clean, fresh water and arsenic. So the idea, especially with an open system, it's not that well. I'll also make another point is, and you probably might have seen my student and I, we had a op-ed in the recent Post-Gazette talking about biodigestion. Many years ago, because again, we need solutions, we need energy, but we could produce up to 10 to 15 trillion cubic feet of natural gas a year just using cow and pig waste that is produced by agriculture annually. So there are solutions, and it's carbon neutral and wouldn't contribute to. So again, they have solutions. I mean, there are solutions out there, and it's not taking the opportunity.
So what are we going to do about labs that aren't looking for lithium, particularly since it's a sensitive tracer and you want to be able to find it?
Again, I think what people understand, get the picture, you've got a lab, and then you've got a private lab. So I'm actually on the journals, everything has to be done in triplicate, everything has to have internal standards, and I have to verify my data. So I stand by my data. The thing is, when you're in a commercial lab, you need to have high throughput. You realize how these companies are testing on a daily basis. And the fact that you look carefully at the lab that actually did the results or did the analysis, and many times they're not the same lab. So they'll send the light hydrocarbon stuff to this lab, and they'll send the anion to this lab. For certain things out of detection limits. Prime example of that, how this is not, you know, or they're so be
Okay. We got them coming. It's not yours, but here's a question for Dr. Jansto. It says, thank you for calling it CO2 waste, saying what it is, good. The question then is in regards to, I was getting there, 49 CFR 195, which CO2 is regulated under. Do you feel regulating liquefied gases under the same regulation as jet fuels and oils? The second question is also about cathodic protections, as it is currently stands in integrity. Do you feel cathodic is being used properly?
Okay, thank you. In early January, the PHMSA had put together about close to, as I recall, a 300-page proposal to address all of the regulations that are currently for CO2. And what they did was they were looking at putting inserts into some of these regulations about defining threshold limits for H2S and moisture in CO2. Unfortunately, after January 20th, when you look at that, that whole document is embargoed. It appears as though PHMSA was going in the right direction and the industry was trying to move toward understanding this CO2 waste gas and moisture issues with the liquid to gas phase transformations needed to be better regulated. The second question, cathodic protection, awesome. There's a cost involved. And where cathodic protection really took a leapfrog in technology was in the infrastructure of bridges and reducing corrosion. So cathodic protection is one of those potential solutions. And you know, that's why I mentioned in the presentation, we need to be looking at solutions. But this cathodic protection would be helpful, but it's not the silver bullet. And then we get the economics. And unfortunately, to keep it at CO2 as a liquid, you really need a tight control on your pressure, temperature, or the last thing I'd like to say is that the moisture just doesn't make carbonic acid. You know, like I mentioned, we've got sulfuric, we've got H2S to make sulfuric acid. So the acidic corrosion risk, I think, came to the forefront when PHMSA put together that rough draft proposal.
Thank you. Here's a question with no speaker specified. Is there a relationship between the age of the well, how salty it is, and the radium concentration?
You want to answer that?
Yeah,
I'm not in the hot seat.
let's see.
I mean, well, it's, you know, it's going to be it depends, like,
Well, there's a big difference between flowback and produced water. So the initial stuff that goes down and comes back up, we call that flowback because it has most of the, you know, constituents and characteristics of what you put down the hole. But as that stuff sits and percolates for days, weeks, months, years, but at least, you know, from our papers that we've published, it looks like it plateaus after a particular time frame, and it's just essentially volumes that are different rather than composition.
okay. One person asked, what's a zone of presumption? That's the legally defined area around a wellhead wherein if there's a problem, it's presumed to be the well operator's fault.
Yeah.
So you get free water.
But I've been given the big old red stop sign, but thanks again to our
Thank you
panel.
very much.
Thank you.